At 9:18 in the morning on October 11th, 1943, Colonel Devlin Rourke was sitting at 28,000 feet above the jungle coast of New Guinea. Below him, stacked in layers between 15 and 20,000 feet, was the largest concentration of Japanese aircraft he had ever seen in his life. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, moving through the sky like a dark river that had no visible banks. 60 aircraft, maybe more. He had 4 planes. Any rational man wearing his rank would have turned around, would have radioed the base, would have called for reinforcements and written a thorough report and waited for someone above him to make the next decision. That is what the system was designed to produce. Rational men making rational decisions based on rational odds. Rourke pushed the throttle forward and started climbing higher. To understand why he did that, why a decorated colonel with a chest full of ribbons would point 4 aircraft at 60 and keep going, you have to go back. Not to that morning, not even to New Guinea. You have to go back to the argument that had been following Devlin Rourke since the moment he arrived in the Pacific Theater with his P-47 Thunderbolts, and every senior officer in the region looked at his machines and quietly shook their heads. Devlin Rourke grew up in a small town outside Abilene, Texas, in a house that smelled like motor oil and iron filings. His father fixed engines for a living, truck engines, tractor engines, whatever came through the door. The boy who would one day fly 7-ton machines into combat spent his childhood learning that a machine will tell you the truth if you are patient enough to listen to it. That the numbers written in a manual are the beginning of understanding, not the end of it. That the difference between a machine that fails you and a machine that saves your life is almost always in the details that most people consider too small to matter. He was not the most naturally gifted pilot in any room he walked into. He knew that about himself without bitterness. What he had instead was something rarer. He was the kind of man who read every technical document twice, who stayed after the briefing to ask the question nobody else had thought of, who sat with the mechanics at the end of the day, not because regulations required it, but because the mechanics knew things the manuals didn't. He arrived in the Pacific Theater in the summer of 1943 with a group of P-47 Thunderbolts and a reputation for being thorough, and he was immediately surrounded by men who were certain his airplane was a liability. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not built for this part of the world. That was the official position, and on paper it made complete sense. The aircraft weighed 7 tons when fully loaded. It was powered by an 18-cylinder Pratt and Whitney radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower and made a sound you felt in your sternum before your ears registered it. It was the biggest, heaviest, single-engine fighter America had put into the war. Built wide, built thick, built to absorb punishment that would have torn a smaller aircraft into scrap. In Europe it had found its purpose: high-altitude escort work, diving on German ground targets, flying through flak that shredded lesser machines, and coming home with holes in the wings that a mechanic could patch before morning. But the Pacific was not Europe, and the Pacific had the zero. The Mitsubishi A6M was everything the Thunderbolt was not. It weighed less than half as much. Its engine was tuned for agility rather than endurance. It carried almost no armor because armor was weight, and weight was the enemy of the thing that made the Zero dangerous: its ability to turn. American pilots who had faced it in the early years of the war described fighting one as trying to swat a hummingbird with a baseball bat. It could reverse direction in a space that felt physically impossible. It could climb fast, maneuver hard, and sustain a turning engagement almost indefinitely. And it had used those qualities to tear through American, British, and Dutch air forces from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies like a blade through canvas. Every pilot in the Pacific had learned the same lesson, usually from someone who had barely survived learning it themselves. The first rule, the rule carved into the walls of every briefing room from Hawaii to Australia: Simple and absolute. Never turn with a zero. If you try to outmaneuver it, you will lose. Every time. Without exception, the P-47 could not outturn a zero on the best day it ever had. Senior officers in the theater looked at Rourke's squadron and saw men flying a machine that violated the only defensive principle that had kept American pilots alive. They were not wrong to be concerned. They were working with every piece of evidence available to them, and every piece of evidence said the same thing. The Thunderbolt was a European machine that had been dropped into the wrong ocean. The mockery was not always loud. Sometimes it was quieter than that, and the quiet kind has a way of staying with a man longer, a dismissive expression in a briefing room. An assignment that kept the Thunderbolts away from anything that mattered. A comment passed between staff officers, just barely loud enough to carry, about how the boys in those fat, round-nosed machines were going to get themselves chewed apart the first time they ran into serious zero opposition. Pilots flying lighter aircraft would glance over at the Thunderbolts on the flight line with a kind of practiced sympathy. The look you give a man who has made a decision you already know is going to cost him. The jug, they called it, because the fuselage was round and thick and shaped. With some generosity of imagination, like a milk jug, it flew like one, some said. It belonged in a different ocean, said others. It was a flying safe, a bus with guns, a machine that had no business being in the same sky as something as precise and lethal as the Zero. Devlin Rourke heard all of it. He did not argue back. He did not get angry in the way that men get angry when their pride is touched. He did something that the men doing the dismissing could not quite read, and therefore found faintly unsettling. He went back to the numbers. The Zero had a weakness. He had seen it in the data before he ever left the continental United States, buried in a dry engineering report that described the aircraft's performance characteristics across different altitude bands. The kind of document that most pilots skimmed or skipped entirely, because the important information was always up front, and everything after page 4 was for engineers. Rourke had read it to the last page. The Zero had no turbo supercharger. In practical terms, this meant that as altitude increased and the air thinned, the Zero's engine began to lose power in a way it could not compensate for. At 15,000 feet, the Zero was the most dangerous single-engine fighter in the Pacific. At 20,000 feet, it was still formidable. But above 22,000, the thin air began to starve the engine. The climb rate dropped. The top speed dropped. The razor precision that made it terrifying at low altitude became something ordinary, something manageable. The P-47, by contrast, had a turbo supercharger that fed compressed air into that 18-cylinder engine regardless of altitude. At 25,000 feet, where the Zero was already struggling, the Thunderbolt was running at the peak of its design. And when you pointed it downward from that altitude, when you gave that machine a straight drop from 28,000 feet, the physics of what happened next were not subtle. A heavy object falling from a great height does not simply go fast. It goes faster than anything that started from a lower position could possibly follow. A Thunderbolt in a full-power dive from altitude could reach speeds that left pursuing Zeros so far behind they might as well have been parked. Rourke had known this before he ever climbed into a cockpit in the Pacific. The critics had the evidence they needed to dismiss the Thunderbolt. He had evidence they had not yet thought to look for. The difference was that his evidence had never been tested in actual combat. Until he could prove it under real conditions, against real aircraft, at real altitude, it was still just a man with an opinion. He began building the proof at WWII. Working with his ground crew through the early weeks of his deployment, Rourke treated the preparation process the way a craftsman approaches a commission that has to last. He was not interested in what the Thunderbolt was designed to do in general. He was interested in what his specific aircraft could do at the specific altitudes and in the specific conditions of the Southwest Pacific. He and his mechanics adjusted the turbo supercharger settings to optimize power output at altitude. They worked the engine at full capacity during test runs, mapping the points where performance exceeded the manual's projections and the points where it fell short. They pushed the aircraft to find its real limits rather than its published ones. Most pilots flew the machines they were given. Rourke flew a machine he had helped build from the inside out. Then he drilled his pilots until the doctrine was not a strategy they were following, but a reflex they had developed. Climb before you engage. Always. You do not start a fight below 20,000 feet if there is any way to avoid it. You identify your target from above. You roll into the dive and you build your speed on the way down. By the time you reach firing range, you are moving at over 400 miles per hour, and the Japanese pilot you are targeting has somewhere between 2 and 3 seconds to react. You fire at close range, you blow through the formation, and then you climb. Immediately, you climb even when every instinct developed flying lighter aircraft is screaming at you to turn back and finish the engagement. You climb because the moment you slow down and start circling, you have left the fight you know how to win and entered the fight the Zero was built for. He called it altitude discipline. He was relentless about it. The first real test came in the weeks before October 11th, when Rourke led his flight against a Japanese patrol and brought down 4 enemy aircraft without losing a single thunderbolt. The tactic worked exactly as the doctrine predicted. 4 aircraft appeared from high altitude at enormous speed, passed through the formation with the force of something that could not be argued with, and climbed back up before the surviving pilots could even reverse their turns. 4 kills, no losses. By any measure, a success. By the measure of theater command, a promising result that required additional data before it changed anyone's conclusions about the Thunderbolt's role in the Pacific. Rourke needed more data. He knew precisely where to get it. Allied reconnaissance had been building a picture of WWII for months. What that picture showed was not comfortable reading. WWII was not an outpost. It was the main hub of Japanese air power across the entire New Guinea campaign, a complex of airstrips staging aircraft for operations across the Southwest Pacific. Reconnaissance photographs indicated between 100 and 150 aircraft at any given time. General Voss, commanding the 5th Air Force, understood that WWII had to be broken. You could not advance an army up the coast of New Guinea with that kind of air power sitting behind you. Rourke volunteered for a reconnaissance in force, a small, fast flight. Go in, assess activity, engage targets of opportunity, and exit before the base defenses could organize. The number of aircraft he proposed raised eyebrows at the command level. 4 Thunderbolts. The response carried a familiar weight. Careful language, measured professional concern, the kind of words that meant with complete precision that the men delivering them believed they were looking at a funeral procession dressed up as a mission plan. Rourke heard every word of it. He had been hearing variations of it since the day he landed in the Pacific. He understood where it came from. He did not resent the men who said it. They were doing their jobs with the information they had. He was doing his job with the information they hadn't found yet. On the morning of October 11th, 1943, Colonel Devlin Rourke led his 3 wingmen north from Dobodura, climbing the entire way. The Thunderbolts pressed through 20,000 feet and kept going. Past 23,000, up to 28,000 feet, where the air was thin enough to kill the engine of a Zero and the turbo supercharger of a Thunderbolt was doing exactly what Rourke had spent months preparing it to do. When WWII appeared below him and the full scale of the Japanese formation became visible, there was no hesitation, no reassessment, no radio call back to base for guidance. There was only the recognition that every calculation had been correct. He rolled the Thunderbolt over, pointed the nose straight down, and gave the machine what it had been built for. Before the dive began, before the throttle moved and the nose dropped and the physics took over, Rourke had done one thing that none of his wingmen noticed. He checked the gun camera, not to confirm it was functioning. He knew it was functioning. He checked it the way a man checks a document he intends to submit as final evidence. because that was exactly what it was. The reconnaissance reports had placed 60 aircraft at WWII, the formation spreading below him across several thousand feet of vertical airspace was larger than 60. How much larger he could not say precisely. What he could say with certainty was that it did not change the plan. The camera would record what was actually there. That was the point. That had always been the point. He rolled the Thunderbolt over and the negotiation ended. The moment a heavily loaded aircraft commits to a dive from 28,000 feet, certain things become true that were not true before. Time compresses. Distances that seemed manageable become immediate. The airspeed indicator moves with a conviction that has no patience for doubt. Rourke felt the Thunderbolt build its speed the way a man of his background felt it, not as sensation alone, but as data. Numbers moving in a direction that confirmed what the calculations had already told him on the ground at WWII. He had his first target acquired before the airspeed passed 350 miles per hour. The Ki-46 reconnaissance aircraft, Allied pilots called it the Diner, was running straight and level at the upper edge of its comfortable altitude range. Long-nosed, twin-engine, built for speed and range rather than combat. Its crew were technicians doing a technical job in an aircraft that gave them no meaningful way to fight back against what was falling toward them from above. They were photographing, they were navigating, they were doing exactly what reconnaissance crews are supposed to do, which is move through the sky with efficiency and return with information. They never looked up. Rourke closed the distance in seconds, fired his 850 caliber machine guns at a range so short that the margin for error had ceased to exist as a practical concept. The Diner came apart completely. One moment a functioning aircraft on a heading with a purpose, the next a collection of separate pieces tracing individual arcs toward the jungle canopy far below. He was already pulling up before the wreckage fell 100 feet. Kill number 1. From the start of the dive to the moment of destruction, less time had passed than it takes to read a paragraph aloud. That compression of violence into a single, irreversible instant was not an accident. It was the entire architecture of what he had built at WWII. An engagement so brief and so decisive that the enemy had no operational window in which to respond. He climbed. The turbo supercharger held the power output steady as the altitude increased. Below him, the Japanese formation was beginning to process the event. Not panic yet, something more dangerous in its early stages, the cognitive delay of trained men trying to fit an unexpected fact into a framework that had no prepared category for it. That delay was the window, and Rourke was already inside it again. A Zero fighter had broken from its position in the formation and was climbing hard toward 20,000 feet, its pilot pulling everything the engine could give. At lower altitude, that climb would have been something to respect. At 15,000 feet, the Zero's climb rate was one of the qualities that had made it dominant in the early years of the Pacific War, a rate that seemed to violate the normal relationship between aircraft weight and vertical performance. But this Zero was not at 15,000 feet. It was above 22,000, and the engine that had seemed almost supernatural at lower altitudes was now running in air thin enough to steal its authority. The climb was labored. The precision that defined the aircraft in its natural environment had been replaced by something Rourke recognized immediately: vulnerability. He rolled and dove again, hit the Zero while it was still committed to the climb, slow, pointing in a direction it could not change fast enough, reaching for an altitude that was always going to be a few seconds short of where the kill was already arriving. The 50 calibers at close range turned the lightest, most maneuverable fighter in the Pacific into a fireball that fell away from the formation like a dropped torch. Kill number 2. Below him, the formation was no longer confused. It was reacting. Zero fighters were breaking off from escort positions, trying to find angles, trying to climb toward a threat that kept appearing and disappearing before they could organize a coherent response. The pilots in that formation were not poor aviators. They were experienced, trained, flying machines they understood deeply. What they did not have was the altitude, and without the altitude, everything else they knew how to do was operating at a permanent deficit. Rourke's third pass targeted a Mitsubishi G4M bomber moving through the lower edge of the formation. Allied crews called it the Betty. Long wings, enormous fuel capacity, tanks that ran the full length of the wing structure without the self-sealing protection that American bomber designers had built into their aircraft after learning the hard lesson about unprotected aviation fuel and .50 caliber rounds. The Betty carried its own destruction inside it, waiting for someone to provide the ignition. Rourke came down from above and behind, where the tail gunner's field of fire was narrowest and the wing roots were directly exposed. He held the trigger through the pass with a steadiness that only becomes possible when speed has compressed everything into a single, committed moment. The .50 calibers crossed the left wing root and the fuel found the heat. The Betty's left wing lit from root to tip in one sustained burn. The aircraft rolled over immediately, pulled down by the imbalance and the fire simultaneously, going into a descent that was already a conclusion before Rourke had finished the pullout. A column of black smoke climbed up through the layers of the Japanese formation. Thick, dark, unmistakable. The kind of signal that every pilot in that sky could read, and none of them had asked for: kill number 3. The formation below had transformed from an organized operational flight into something closer to a system that had lost its internal logic. Aircraft turning in multiple directions, escort fighters abandoning their positions to chase a threat that would not stay in one place long enough to be chased. The disruption was visible from altitude, in the way that disruption always becomes visible from above, as a pattern of movement that no longer makes collective sense. Rourke watched it with the specific clarity of a man whose preparation has put him in exactly the situation he spent months preparing for. He could see the geometry, he could see the gaps, he could see the places where the formation's disintegration had created angles that did not exist 20 minutes earlier. And then he saw something that was not an opportunity. One of his wingmen had drifted lower than the doctrine required, not by recklessness, by the accumulated pressure of an engagement moving faster than any training exercise could fully simulate, by the instinct of a pilot who had come up flying lighter aircraft, whose earlier training had carved a different set of reflexes into his responses. The drift was a matter of altitude that, in any other context, might have been recoverable. A zero had acquired him. Closing from behind, angle tightening. The Japanese pilot had found his geometry, target below him, speed advantage, firing solution developing with each passing second. In that specific configuration, he had everything the doctrine said you needed to win. Rourke did not calculate the intercept. Calculation requires time, and time was the one thing the situation was not offering. He rolled and dove on instinct, sharpened to the edge of reflex by months of drilling a single principle into every response he had. He dropped between the zero and his wingman with enough closing speed that the Japanese pilot's options collapsed in less than a second. Break off or be destroyed. The choice was made for him before he could fully process that it existed. Rourke held the trigger through the pass, and the zero disintegrated at a range so close that the Thunderbolt flew directly through the space where the aircraft had been. Through the dispersing cloud of fuel vapor and aluminum fragments and heat, the fuselage and wings absorbing the impact of debris the way the machine had been designed to absorb it. Solid, unyielding, built for exactly this. Kill number 4. The wingman climbed away, unaware of the specific mathematics of how close the margin had been. 3 of Rourke's pilots were signaling now, the silent arithmetic of combat logistics that no amount of adrenaline can override forever. Ammunition running low, fuel state demanding attention. The numbers that a pilot carries in the back of his mind through every second of an engagement, the numbers that eventually make the decision regardless of what the situation might still be offering. The rational call was clear. Climb, form up, go home. 4 kills confirmed. Every pilot still alive. A gun camera full of footage that was going to be very difficult for anyone at Theatre Command to dismiss. By any professional standard, the mission had succeeded beyond what the men who approved it had believed possible. Rourke acknowledged the signals and began the climb. Then he saw the 5th target, a 0 sitting at the wrong altitude, isolated from the rest of the formation by the general disruption, its pilot still trying to locate the source of attacks that had come and gone 4 times without warning. It was not searching effectively. It was reacting to information that was already 30 seconds out of date, turning toward a position Rourke no longer occupied. A machine with nowhere to put its capability because the situation it was trained for had not materialized, and the situation that had materialized instead was one it had no framework to address. Rourke dove, hit it while the pilot was still mid-turn, still committed to a heading that led nowhere useful. Clean, direct, final, kill number 5. Then he saw the 6th. He was lower now than at any previous point in the engagement, deeper into the altitude band where the Zeros had recovered some of their operational authority. The comfortable margin that altitude and speed had provided through every earlier pass was thinner than it had any right to be, and he knew it with the precise awareness of a man who had built his entire method on maintaining exactly the margin he was now depleting. He committed anyway. He fired through the pass with the kind of resolution that closes the door on second thoughts before they can fully form. The target came apart, and then the pullout began. Not the smooth mechanical recovery of a machine operating within its designed envelope, but something harder and more urgent, the thunderbolt responding to full emergency power with a shudder that communicated, in the language of stressed airframes and maxed-out engines, that the request being made of it was at the outer boundary of what was possible. The dive angle had taken him far lower than the doctrine called for. The jungle canopy below was not a distant abstraction. It was a surface with specific proximity, and the rate at which that proximity was increasing had a quality that demanded complete attention. He held the pullout through the G-force that pressed him into the seat with the weight of several times his own body. The thunderbolt came through the bottom of the arc, trailing heat and engine noise, and the particular evidence of a machine that has been asked for everything it has and has not yet decided whether to give it. And then he flew through what remained of the aircraft he had just destroyed. Not the sharp, percussive impact of Kill 4, where debris had struck the airframe at high, relative speed. This was different, slower, more suspended, as if the wreckage was hanging in the air, waiting for him to pass through it. Pieces of the destroyed Zero drifting in the space his dive had created, and the thunderbolt moving through them with a strange, almost deliberate passage that gave him enough time to understand, clearly and without ambiguity, how precisely he had used up the last of the margin he had been carrying since 28,000 feet. Kill number 6. The Zeros that attempted to follow him upward lasted less than a minute before the altitude ended their pursuit. They fell away below, unable to reach the altitude where Rourke was already leveling out, already pointing south, the fuel gauges telling him what he already knew, enough to reach Dobodura, not enough for anything else. 6 kills, 4 aircraft, every pilot alive, and a gun camera that had recorded every second of it, from the first pass on the diner to the final debris field of kill number 6, in the unambiguous visual language of a machine that had no stake in the outcome and no reason to record anything other than exactly what had happened. He flew south over the jungle in the quiet that follows a violent thing. Below him, 3 columns of smoke still climbed into the sky above Wewak, visible from 20 miles, marking the location of a debate that was about to end in the only way debates of that kind can genuinely end. Not with better arguments, with evidence that makes argument impossible. The thunderbolt touched down at Dobodura with fuel gauges reading numbers that made the ground crew go quiet. Not the quiet of men with nothing to say. The quiet of men doing arithmetic and arriving at the same answer and not wanting to say it out loud. The aircraft rolled to a stop and the engine wound down from its deep, authoritative rumble to silence, and for a moment the only sound on the flight line was hot metal contracting in the morning air. The crew chief walked the full length of the aircraft and said nothing. He counted holes the way an experienced man counts them, not with alarm, but with the careful attention of someone building an accurate picture. Wing surfaces, fuselage, the places where pieces of other aircraft had struck the Thunderbolt's skin at high speed and left marks that told their own story about the geometry of the final pass. He ran his hand along the aluminum the way Rourke's father had once run his hand along a cracked engine block, feeling for what the eyes might miss. The aircraft had brought its pilot home. That was the first fact. Everything else was maintenance. Rourke climbed down from the cockpit without ceremony. He was 32 years old, and he had just flown 4 aircraft into 60 and come back with every pilot alive, and the way he moved across the flight line toward the intelligence tent carried none of the performance that a lesser man might have allowed himself. No lingering for effect. 4. No visible acknowledgement of what the fuel gauges had been reading on final approach. He walked the way a man walks when he has done the thing he set out to do and the next task is already presenting itself. The debrief began within the hour. The intelligence officers approached Rourke's account with the systematic skepticism their training required. Pilots returned from engagements with honest accounts, containing honest errors. Memory under combat stress was not a recording device. Standard procedure was to work through the sequence methodically, cross-reference against the wingmen's independent reports, and arrive at a number that the evidence could support. They were not prepared for the number Rourke gave them. He walked them through it in sequence. Altitude of initial contact, formation, composition, and layering. The Chi 46 first, heading, altitude, angle of approach, observed result. Then the 0 on the climb. Then the Betty, wing route, the fuel. Then the 4th, the wingman rescue. Then 5, then 6. The officers wrote fast. They asked him to slow down and repeat details. They looked at each other in the way that people look at each other when the data they are recording does not match the data they expected to record, and they need confirmation that they are hearing what they think they are hearing. 6 confirmed kills, 4 aircraft, no losses, over WWII. One of the officers set his pencil down for a moment, looked at his notes, and picked it up again without comment. They sent for the gun camera film before the debrief was officially complete, because the gun camera film was the only instrument in that room with no stake in the outcome. It did not have opinions about which aircraft belonged in which theater. It did not carry the institutional memory of every zero that had destroyed an American pilot who thought he had a workable plan. It recorded light, and it did not care what the light showed. The film took time to process. Rourke waited. He sat in the heat outside the intelligence tent and drank water, and looked at nothing in particular with the patience of a man who has already done the work, and understands that patience is now the only remaining requirement. Somewhere in a dark room on that base, the evidence was developing frame by frame, indifferent to the debate it was about to settle. When the footage was ready, it was screened in a room that held more senior officers than the debrief had. Word travels in a military installation the way water finds low ground, without announcement and with a directness that no formal communication channel can replicate. The number 6 had been moving through the base since the aircraft landed, carried by the ground crew, by the debrief officers, by the particular quality of silence that had followed the crew chief's walk around the Thunderbolt. By the time the projector ran, the room was full of men who had heard the number and needed to see what the number actually meant. The footage showed them, frame by frame, in the unambiguous visual language of a gun camera recording an engagement from the cockpit of the aircraft conducting it. The dives from altitude, The firing passes at ranges that left no interpretive space, the pull-outs and the climbs back up before the Japanese formation could consolidate a response. 6 separate aircraft, each one whole in one frame and not whole in the next, destroyed in a sequence so methodical and so consistent that it did not resemble the chaotic instinct-driven footage that combat gun cameras usually produced. It looked like a demonstration. It looked like a man who had told you exactly what he was going to do, and then done it with a precision that had no gap between the stated intention and the executed result. The room watched in the particular silence of men whose professional framework is being revised in real time. Not the silence of being convinced by an argument, the deeper silence of watching evidence that makes the argument irrelevant. Rourke had not persuaded anyone of anything. The footage had simply removed the ground on which disagreement had been standing. When the projector stopped, General Voss sat for a moment without speaking. Then he said 2 words to the officer beside him: "Write it up." The recommendation for the Medal of Honor moved through channels with a speed that reflected how clearly General Voss understood what the footage documented. Not simply a remarkable individual performance, though it was unquestionably that, a proof of concept that changed the operational picture for every P-47 Thunderbolt flying in the Pacific Theater. A demonstration that the aircraft the theater had written off as a liability was, under the right doctrine in the right hands, something the Japanese air forces in New Guinea had no prepared answer for. General Macready reviewed the recommendation and approved it the same week. The ceremony was held on the flight line at WWII in the open air, in front of the men who had flown and maintained and prepared those aircraft through the weeks and months of dismissal and skepticism. Macready stood before Rourke in the particular way of a senior officer who understands that the moment requires something beyond the procedural. He pinned the Medal of Honor to Rourke's uniform and looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look one man gives another when the words available are insufficient to the occasion, and both men know it. Around them, the pilots and ground crew who had lived through every doubt, every sideways comment, every assignment designed to keep the Thunderbolts away from the serious work, stood without ceremony and without noise. Macready finally spoke. Not a speech. 3 sentences. The last one was simply, "You were right." 3 words that carry a different weight when spoken by the man who had the authority to end the conversation and chose instead to let it run for months. Rourke received them the way he received most things, directly, without performance, with the quiet acknowledgement of a man for whom being right was never the point. The point had always been proving it in a way that could not be walked back. The Medal of Honor was that proof, made permanent, made official, made part of the record that outlasted the debate. Within weeks, the altitude discipline doctrine that Rourke had built from a technical document and a mechanic's understanding of his own aircraft was being integrated into the formal training guidance of the 5th Air Force. The machine that had been called a flying safe and a liability and a European problem deposited in the wrong ocean was now the aircraft that had produced the most dramatic single mission result of the Pacific Air War to that point. The pilots who flew it began to carry themselves differently, not with arrogance, with the specific confidence of men who have been told their equipment cannot do the job and have watched it do the job and have been given a doctrine precise enough to do it again. The institutional skepticism had nowhere left to stand. The footage had seen to that. Rourke kept flying. That fact carries a weight that is easy to underestimate if you frame it only as persistence. It was something more complicated than persistence. He had proven what he came to prove. He had the Medal of Honor. He had the doctrine in the training manuals. He had achieved, in a single morning over WWII, everything that his months of preparation and argument and dismissal had been building toward. He kept flying anyway. By early 1944, he had 22 confirmed aerial kills, which placed him among the leading American aces in any theater of the entire war. The number that lived in every room he entered, never spoken directly, never written on any briefing document, but present with the quiet insistence of a fact that everyone has already calculated, was 26. Eddie Rickenbacker's record from the First World War, the highest confirmed kill total any American pilot had achieved in combat. Nobody told Rourke this was what he was chasing. Nobody needed to. The arithmetic was not complicated, and the man had built his entire career on doing the arithmetic that other people had not bothered to run. The drive that had made him read the technical document past page 4. The drive that had made him push the throttle forward when 60 aircraft filled the sky below him. The drive that could not find a reason to stop once it had found a direction. That drive did not recognize the distinction between the application that had made him right and the application that was now moving him towards something no doctrine could fully protect against. It was the same drive, the same man, the same inability to accept the available stopping point. On the morning of March 5, 1944, Colonel Devlin Rourke flew into an engagement over WWII. The same sky, the same jungle coast, the same geography where he had made history on a single October morning 4 months earlier. The conditions were not the same. He was at a disadvantageous altitude when the engagement developed, below the threshold that his own doctrine identified as the minimum acceptable starting position. The distribution of enemy aircraft was not in his favor in the specific way that his method had been designed to address. The path back to altitude, the path the doctrine required, the path that had carried him safely through every engagement he had led with the discipline that altitude demanded, that path was not available in the configuration the situation required. He was shot down over the jungle of New Guinea on March 5, 1944. He was 32 years old. The war had another year and a half left to run without him. There is a quality to what that means, that the flat, procedural language of military records cannot fully carry. Devlin Rourke did not die because his doctrine failed. He did not die because the aircraft let him down or because the pilots he faced that morning were better than the ones he had defeated before. He died because the same quality that had made him build the doctrine in the first place, the forward pressure that could not be turned off, the refusal to stop when stopping was the rational choice, had carried him one time into the precise configuration of circumstances that the doctrine itself had been designed to avoid. The man who understood, with more clarity than anyone in the Pacific theater, the exact conditions under which his aircraft was a predator and not prey, encountered the one arrangement of facts where the lesson he had taught everyone else did not reach him in time. What he left behind did not diminish. The tactical framework built from his understanding of the Thunderbolt's actual capabilities, as opposed to the capabilities that institutional assumption had assigned to it, became foundational doctrine for the 5th Air Force through the remainder of the Pacific campaign. Pilots who had never met him flew his method into engagements across New Guinea and the Philippines and the island chains that stretched toward Japan. They climbed to altitude before engaging. They dove from positions of height advantage. They built attack speed on the way down and climbed back up before the enemy could organize a coherent response. They did not turn with zeros. They survived because of it, many of them, in numbers that no gun camera could record because the absence of death does not produce footage. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew more than 700,000 combat sorties across every theater of the war, a machine that had been called a flying bus, a liability, a European problem in the wrong ocean. It absorbed punishment on a scale that validated every design choice that had made it seem too heavy and too slow and too large for the Pacific fight, and it brought its pilots home from engagements that lighter aircraft would not have survived. The Thunderbolt sits in museums today. Visitors walk around it and see what it presents to the eye: the massive round nose of the Pratt and Whitney radial, the wide landing gear, the thick fuselage that earned it its nickname, the 8 gun ports in the wings that suggest, without requiring explanation, what the aircraft was built to do. They see a monument to American industrial capacity at the peak of its wartime output. They see brute force given wings. They do not see page 4 of a technical document and the man who kept reading when everyone else had already closed the file. They do not see the weeks at WWII with a crew chief mapping the supercharger's performance curve against altitudes nobody else was flying. They do not see the briefing tent where a doctrine was built by a man who had been told with the full authority of institutional experience that he was wrong. They do not see 4 aircraft pointing north towards 60. They do not see the gun camera running. They do not see the smoke above WWII climbing into the October sky. 3 columns marking the morning the institutional skepticism ran out of ground to stand on. And they do not see a 32-year-old man from Texas who understood one thing with a clarity the system around him could not match: that the truth about what a machine can do lives in the numbers, and the numbers do not care who else has read them. He climbed higher than anyone told him he needed to go. He stayed up there when every voice in the room below said to come down. He proved what he knew with evidence that could not be walked back. And he gave the men who came after him a way to fight that kept them alive long enough to come home. That is what he left in the sky above New Guinea. Not the record, not the medal, not even the 6 columns of smoke above WWII that marked the morning everything changed. The altitude, the discipline to climb to it and hold it and trust it, even when every instinct said otherwise. Devlin Rourke flew into that sky one last time on March the 5th, 1944, and did not come back down. But the altitude he had shown them, that thin, cold, honest air above 25,000 feet where the jug ran strong and the zero gasped, that altitude flew on in every thunderbolt that climbed past 20,000 feet for the rest of the war, in every pilot who held the climb when the instinct said, brake, in every engagement where a heavy machine from the wrong ocean dove out of the thin air at 400 miles per hour and reminded the sky that the truth about what a thing can do is never found in the opinions of men who have not yet run the numbers. It is found up there, where the air is cold and thin and honest, where the jug was always, from the very beginning, exactly where it belonged.